All right, so Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everyone, inshallah, we're going to be continuing with Tafseer al-Qurtubi and Tafseer, of course, Surah Al-An'am. And let's just kind of go over some of the things that we did last time. I know you could see the scribbles, but let's just go over a little bit of what we had done. وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا إِلَى أُمَمٍ مِّن قَبْلِكَ فَأَخَذْنَاهُم بِالْبَأْسَاءِ وَالضَّرَّاءِ. So last time, we actually did like an overview tafsir for 3 pages, not two. And then in Tafsir al-Qurtubi, I believe we left off at here we go. We left off at فَمَنْ آمَنَ وَأَصْلَحَ فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. This is where we left off at because we didn't want to leave it another spot, so we stayed basically longer than the expected timing for the class in order to stay up until فَمَنْ آمَنَ وَأَصْلَحَ فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. And why did we leave at that spot? Because if you look at every single class, we have to at least stop at a place where it would be kind of like a good conclusion, if you would say. Okay, like a good promising conclusion. So when you look at that conclusion, if we are to die, at least we would end up, the last ayah as فَمَنْ آمَنَ وَأَصْلَحَ فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. Okay, but in Tafsir al-Qurtubi, I don't think we did up to here. Let's just go over Tafsir al-Qurtubi and just kind of see what we did. Okay, with Tafsir al-Qurtubi, so then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically telling us about the nations that He had sent, basically the warners, that is the prophets and the messengers. And certainly the people did not respond to the call, in other words, embrace the call. And we went in some details of dua, and we said there are 2 types of dua, and we kind of I guess emphasize that emphasize that very well, which is dua. There's the dua al-mas'ala and there's dua al-ibadah, and we went in details with dua al-ibadah and what that would look like. Dua al-ibadah, so the word dua, we said it actually means to invoke, but this isn't talking about making a request. So it can be a dua that you are praising the Lord Almighty. So it can be a dua that is containing in itself praising the Lord Almighty, or it can be glorifying the Lord Almighty, and all those different good things that you could basically remind yourself about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And even when you want to do dua al-mas'ala, that should be the prelude. That should be the prelude, which is dua al-ibadah should be the start. Okay, dua al-mas'ala is when you're asking for something. So this ayah is basically laying out that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may squeeze people to a certain narrow area in order to provoke in them that dua al-mas'ala, to let them get to dua al-ibadah, to let them find through at least the anxiety, the depression, the narrow spot that they're in. It usually provokes people to invoking the Lord Almighty to seek a way out. But these people, they majority actually had qaswa in al-qalb. What is qaswa in al-qalb? Basically, their hearts were hardened. In other words, the receptors in their hearts were not moist, or were not ready, and certainly the receptors in their heart had already hardened. In other words, they were turned off from receiving any type of, let's call it a trigger, or any type of an alert to let them basically reach out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They didn't recognize that alert. They didn't recognize at least those pricks to let them get those receptors. They didn't recognize any of that. And what they ended up doing is that they basically continued on the path that they were in. And that's when Shaitan had given them the narrative that they saw as comforting for their lifestyle and comforting for basically the deviation that they were living in. Okay, so then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would test them even further, but this time the test wasn't going to be in making them squeezed in a narrow position. This time they were actually going to be getting the abundance of provision. Okay, but the abundance of provision, uh, many would understand the abundance of provision as being an acceptance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as being a reward, and not recognize that that was what is called istidraj. That was basically testing them in how they were going to embrace the Lord Almighty and how they were going to recognize that the provision that they have was not necessarily coming from the efforts that they had invested, but it was actually coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we went in details in talking about, is every provision or is every wealth that you might get, every success that you might get, is it necessarily that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is content over you? And we said no, absolutely not. It can be a test. And then we went in some details in some of what the scholars had said for people to be careful about what you get. Your successes are not necessarily the evidence to prove that you're on the right spot and that you're doing the right thing. It could actually be a test. How are you going to use such privileges? Are you going to use it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or are you going to get carried away thinking that it was really your intelligence? It was basically somehow you getting the privilege because you deserve the privilege, and not that this is a privilege that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will basically question you about. And why am I saying question you about? Because the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that the people would not pass the grave. And in other words, the first thing that they would be encountered with in the grave is that they would be asked about four things. What are the four things that they would be asked about? They would be asked about one, their life, two, their ilm, and three, they would be asked about their youthhood in particular. That's when they were strongest. They're consider it as their the climax of their efforts, the climax of their power. So tell your teenage sons and daughters that this is the climax of your power. This is the climax of your ambitions and all of that. So use it for the right thing, because this is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to basically make the focus of your test in. Okay. And certainly the money and where they had received it from and what they had done with it, that would be also something that they would be questioned about. So we're talking about the ilm, we're talking about money, we're talking about the time and how they use that time. So those are the most important potentials, and we talked about some of those potentials in previous classes. Okay, حتى إذا فرحوا بما أوتوا أخذناهم بغتة فإذا هم مبلسون. They would be extremely happy, but then they don't recognize that was actually a test, and then they would be taken in a sudden punishment. Okay, when we say to be taken in a sudden punishment, نسأل الله العفو والعافية. Okay. What does that mean? What does it mean that it was sudden? Does it mean that when they least expected it? Or does it mean that it was going to be at a specific timing? Or does it mean that it was going to be at noon time, dhuhr time? So specific timing, or is it when they themselves were perhaps sleeping, duha? If you look at the nations, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did mention certain timings that these people were punished in. Not necessarily these particular people, but different nations were punished in. We had seen Qawm Lut. They were punished during the time of Duha. When is the duha time? It's basically the time when people are busy with life. That's around, we're talking about 9 a.m. till probably 11 p.m., 11, sorry, a.m. So we're looking at that time when some are probably at work, others are just busy without them really realizing what's going to happen because they're too busy with things, or they're probably just taking a nap and just resting. Okay, so you got another times when it was during the night. Okay, so just seeing those times when they were basically that Baghta time was something that uh, they didn't recognize. In Surah Al-Ahqaf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that فلما رأوه عارضا العارض is basically the cloud. So they had seen a dark cloud, and what they had expected that this is basically a cloud that's going to bring in rain and lots of rain. They did recognize that it was going to be coming in with a lot of rain, but they didn't anticipate whatsoever that it was going to be not a rain of rahmah, but a rain of adhab. They didn't anticipate that it was not going to be a reign of mercy, but it was going to be a reign of punishment, even though they did say that there was a dark cloud coming in, and they did know. Of course, if it's a dark cloud, that actually means it's a cloud filled with moisture, and therefore it's ready to rain in a good amount of rain. And of course, for al-Ahqaf, بل هو ما استعجلتم به. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them. But that's what you had basically rushed, and the rushing wasn't that they wanted the punishment, but they had done something to basically get that punishment in this dunya even sooner than the akhirah. فقطع دابر القوم الذين ظلموا والحمد لله رب العالمين. قطع دابر القوم, we talked about قطع. What is القطع? القطع actually means to disconnect. Okay, that's the general word. To cut, to disconnect. So قطع دابر القوم, the word قطع basically means that it was disconnected. Disconnected from what? In other words, their legacy, the legacy that they had made. In other words, here we're speaking about if فتحنا عليهم أبواب كل شيء, if كل شيء, sorry, if all the different doors to different successes were then open to them. So if we're talking about nations, civilizations, we're talking about prosperity, economical prosperity, we're talking about political power, we're speaking about military power as well. We're speaking about different types of what would in a civilization be considered as making that success. Okay, so when you see فتحنا عليهم أبواب كل شيء, okay, if we're talking about an individual level, you would be looking at their health is going better. They're probably getting a good, better income. The world is basically opening up for them. Now they're getting good income. Now they're getting a lot of children. Now they're basically starting to get more stable, probably in their social life, etc. But then all that stability that they were getting of dunya and not the stability within. And this is important to keep in mind, usually, especially the younger generation. We talked about this before, and the same applies to Ibn Khaldun. Maybe we could, Ibn Khaldun, he basically described nations as pretty much like the chronology of the individuals. They start out dependent on others, and then to grow, they basically learn how to use their tools and their resources. And once they learn how to use their resources and they become independent in using their resources, that's when they start becoming basically an independent state, an independent country. And the further, and of course, certainly the more they recognize how to make these resources and not depend on others and on other nations or even on other civilizations for their resources, and they become the ones that others depend on with those resources, that's when they become a great nation. That's when they become a great nation. So if you look at the history in different nations, that's how the great nation started out. They started out basically depending on other nations with their resources. Then they later on would let those resources be something that they themselves can actually make. Okay. But of course, no matter how big of a country you are, of course, no matter how big and how magnificent you become, at the end, there's always going to be that decline. That's what Ibn Khaldun says as well, that it takes 4 generations. The first generation basically works hard to get to where they're at. And then the second generation learn how to even advance it furthermore. The third generation gets entitled, and then they basically start depending on trying to maintain what the previous generation had basically advanced, and then the fourth generation basically starts living on what the third generation had basically tried to maintain. But then, of course, if you're not advancing yourself, then what's going to happen? You're basically going to start going into that regression. Then the fourth generation becomes that area of decline. Okay, so the fourth generation becomes the area of decline, and this decline basically is that area that then, of course, starts to bring in, instead of the advancement, brings in the regression. They start losing power, they start losing their resources, they start losing all the different things that their ancestors had basically had in building a legacy. Okay, and certainly, of course, فَقُطِعَ دَابِرُ الْقَوْمِ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا. And any civilization, any type of a legacy that one might start, if it is not on the basis of La ilaha illallah, if it's not basis on truth, then that legacy is going to wear off little by little. So, in other words, the most important legacy, the most important thing that you can leave for your children or leave for your civilization is basically the legacy of La ilaha illallah, because that's what would maintain. That's what would maintain. All the other things, it is part of the cycle, the paradigm that we would see, whether in a Muslim civilization or in a non-Muslim civilization, that it becomes forgotten, that the generations to come, they become entitled, and then they forget all the different efforts and all the different investments that were putting to make the civilization. Okay, just keep that one in mind. فَقُطِعَ دَابِرُ الْقَوْمِ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that the remains, in other words, the legacy had then become disconnected. And for what reason? For the oppression that they had committed. What oppression was it? It's the oppression of shirk, and certainly all the implications that would come basically as a result of shirk that would follow along, just like a dominoes that starts falling one piece after another. So if you said that even the Muslim civilizations went through that, then aren't you contradicting yourself? So when we're speaking about Muslim civilizations, not all civilizations are the same. Even when we're talking about a Muslim civilization, we're talking about, a long time span with even the Muslim civilizations. But we would look at even the Muslim civilizations and we would see the decline, okay, in different dynasties at least. If we're talking about the Abbasid, we're talking about the Umayyad, we're talking about uh, the Mamalik, etc., and all those different dynasties, all those different empires. They basically had many different khulafa, basically, the different caliphs. They came in, and of course, some we would think that all the khulafa were somehow, living the best of their Islam, which is not necessarily the case. Not necessarily the case. You had some khulafa basically had that justice, that piety to do what is right, just like Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Okay, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was even called the fifth Khalifa, and even though he was the grandson of Umar ibn al-Khattab. That well, actually, not the grandson, the great grandson of Umar ibn al-Khattab. Okay, um, and uh, and certainly because of his justice, because of humility, because of the great investment, even though he only ruled for 2 years. Keep that one in mind. He only ruled for 2 years, in fact, a little less. Okay. But the amount of justice that he had brought within the Umayyad Khilafah at the time was so magnificent that he was called the fifth Khalifa. But if you looked at the other dynasties, you look at the other khulafa, were they necessarily living that legacy of Islam? Not all. In fact, you had some khulafa are so bloody that they actually killed their own brothers, their own children sometimes even. Their own family members, and some actually killed all their family members from early childhood because just like in al-Khilafah al-Uthmaniyah, it was given the justification that if there's any error, if there's any uh, expected opponent, even if they're infants in their age of infancy, before they even grow, they would actually kill them, literally kill them, even from early infancy. This was practiced in an era with in a khilafah, believe it or not. That's dhulm, man. La ilaha illallah. I can't wrap my head around that. Just imagine ordering for the assassination and the killing of even babies. And it was presented that it was for the sake of the community, it was for the sake of maintaining the Khilafah from any type of an opposition or any type of a later turmoil that might affect the society. Just imagine. Imagine that this was actually real in a khilafah. Yes, this was actually done and practiced. Or imagine khulafa actually being drunk, khulafa being being at the opponents and even moving a whole army or armies to basically kill their own brothers and assassinate their own brothers. It's a long history, but I just wanted to note right there that the life that we're living in today is probably also the price of all the different things that we had left behind, even our ancestors. So why are we paying the price if our ancestors you know, possibly did something like that? I mean, yeah, my ancestors were not khulafat for sure. None of them were. Not even al-Bayt. So for sure, I was not. I was not of a family that were at all khulafat. Maybe my husband's family was. I have no idea because they're. Yeah. So their name probably goes back to الدولة العامرية maybe in Al-Andalus. I don't know. So I could be the lost princess maybe. Who knows? But if he was going to be the prince, so I would be the lost princess. Okay, anyhow. Um, but what was I saying? Man, I guess I got carried away with thinking of myself as a princess. Sorry, ladies. لا إله إلا الله. Okay, so when you look at فَقُطِعَ دَابِرُ الْقَوْمِ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا, I even forgot the question. لا إله إلا الله. So when we're speaking about al-khilafa, okay, why are we paying the price? Why are we paying the price of something that they had probably committed? So when you're speaking about khair or good, whether we're speaking about khair, good, or evil, it is inevitable that it would still be transmitted down to the children, just as you would transmit perhaps maybe health, good health, or you would transmit wealth, or you would transmit probably social status. It's going to be basically passed down without you realizing. And that's the same thing with religiosity. Okay, same thing with religiosity, but just because your family basically is, a hafid al-Quran or probably a family of scholars, it doesn't necessarily make you as a person deserving that status. That's why the Prophet ﷺ would tell us, Sayyidah Fatima, "O Fatima, اتقي الله فإني لا أغني لك من الله شيئا." Fatima telling his own beloved daughter, have taqwa. I do not have the power on Judgment Day, that is, to protect you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is, if you were to go wrong. Okay. فإني لا أغني لك من الله شيئا. Even though he's a prophet, but he's telling her it's really you that is going to be responsible for yourself, and not because I'm a prophet and you are my daughter. It doesn't mean that you can consider yourself as guaranteeing a salvation just because your father is a prophet. So what does that mean? Well, that basically means you yourself as an individual, you have to maintain the taqwa. So when you say then, okay, we get that point of every single position, every single person is basically going to be responsible for their own thing. But you also said that whatever the ancestors had done, that's going to be still transmitted. It's going to be passed down. It's going to be affecting us still. So the answer is yes, it is going to be passed down, whether it's of a good legacy or whether it's an evil thing. But at the end, you as an individual, you have to recognize that whether it's a provision that you have or whether it's a privilege that you have, let's use a different word, a privilege that you have, or whether we're speaking about a hardship that you, or a fitna, let's use that word, or a fitna, or a trial that uh, you probably had received maybe from your ancestors. Like what type of fitna? Maybe that they were addicts. They had a problem with addiction, and that addiction basically runs into your family. In fact, there is this interesting study that when a woman drinks while she's pregnant, that basically affects the baby's brains, and then the child is more likely to become an addict when they grow older. And in fact, even if we're speaking about women that are pregnant and they would be on basically on drugs, in order to let the child survive, they would give them drug dosage, a certain drug dosage before they could wean them off the amount of drugs. So imagine giving a child drugs in order to help them basically get cured from this addiction. So just think of that. Think of the effect it will have on their brain. Think of the effect that it would have on them getting susceptible to addiction and easier in like down the road, they would be more susceptible to addiction than other people. Oh, that's a fitna right there. If we're speaking about a child from their early childhood, now we are seeing that these children are basically more susceptible and are more susceptible to addiction or more susceptible to fitna. You know, we are already susceptible to it without even having a higher probability as a result of our ancestors. So our ancestor, our mother, our father, whatever it is, now their mistake is a price I'm paying for. That's really scary. Their mistake is a price I'm paying for? The answer is yes, it's a price certainly they'll be held accountable for, but think of this. Remember, the more effort you put in any type of whether it's an addiction or any type of a fitna or any type of an effort to basically in face a hardship, the reward is going to be higher. Think of it this way. The reward is going to be higher. And think of it as, am I going to continue this, whether it's an addiction or probably a fitna that my parents had basically committed? Am I going to continue that line and let my children also more susceptible to that fitna? Or will I end that line and end that probably our ancestors had committed and start a new line of probably piety, a new line of of a good legacy, and basically start myself a line of justice, a line of piety, a line of morality. And certainly the line can change. It's not that it cannot change. Okay, the line can change, but it's an issue of you having the commitment to do so. So before you blame your parents on perhaps why they didn't have the commitment and change the line, well, you work on changing yours. Because if you continue that line, then we're going to answer you and say, well, just like you failed, the same type of reasoning that they may put in as a narrative is basically the same reason that your parents might actually put. In other words, you're continuing the same narrative. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I did prison chaplaincy, and it's quite strange that you would see that a lot of those that are in prison, they actually come from a line usually of addiction. Parents were addicts, parents were probably always unemployed, parents never cared about education, never cared about their children, etc. And then they continue this line. They would continue this line. I did still see some cases. Their parents were actually educated parents. Their parents were probably even scholars. One of those rare cases, um, the mother was a hafid al-Quran. The daughter was at least put in a duksi, which is the Somali Islamic schools of memorizing Quran. And she was memorizing Quran and was actually going to medical school. Imagine that. So, in other words, had a high GPA and was doing pretty well. But then, or at least she was going pre-med. Okay. And of course, basically confused a number of different paths. and subhanallah just went into that addiction by meeting different friends, and these different friends, they played a game on her. Um, they were at a party, and then they put something in her juice. And then she tells me when she woke up, she just felt that everything was blurry. She was just not herself anymore. And then every single time she just felt that she needed to basically uh, later get into this hyper and intense feelings of something. And then later on, her friends told her that they had put something in her juice, which they of course, put in drugs. And then later on, basically went from being a student that was going pre-med, a student that was attending Quran, a student that was just one mistake, going with the wrong group. Just one mistake. One mistake. And subhanAllah, later she becomes a drug addict, then basically enters prison because of sex trafficking. It's a mess. It's a mess. Just a mess. نسأل الله العفو والعافية. So how was that related to what I was talking about? Subhanallah. Um, Sorry, ladies. I just went into a different mood. When I would talk about prison, it really affects me. It really, really affects me when I speak of prison and what I had seen in prisons. It, you know, ugh, it's definitely not something I would like to remember. Um, Working as a chaplain in prisons, it, I had seen a lot of tears there, a lot of tears. Many people going through a lot of regret, a lot of Muslims basically in prison. Uh, for the wrong choices. And it was a friend, or probably sometimes that they went to get an education. They really went to go to school, and they were really good in school and all of that. But then, subhanAllah, things just didn't go the way that they had expected. And then they basically went far from what their parents were basically trying to invest in them. Okay, so I'm not saying that every single uh, every single parent is going to hold the responsibility of their young children, because at the end, their their children are basically going to be accountable because they are considered as adults. But at the same time, we have to be aware, we have to be wise in how we give those privileges for our children. Okay. And understanding this area is probably important within this context. Not every privilege is necessarily something that is good. Sometimes you have to reduce the privileges in order to keep them connected to the investment. That in order to achieve something, you would have to work hard to get. فقطع دابر القوم الذين ظلموا والحمد لله رب العالمين. And certainly any oppression, any distance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it was going to face the same fate. What is it? That it's going to face the fate that it will be ended. والحمد لله رب العالمين. All right. قل أرأيتم إن أخذ الله سمعكم وأبصاركم وختم على قلوبكم من إله غير الله يأتيكم به انظر كيف نصرف الآيات ثم هم يصدفون قل أرأيتكم إن أتاكم عذاب الله بغتة أو جهرة هل يهلك إلا القوم الظالمون. And saith their hearing and their sight was taken away. Why would their hearing, their sight be taken away? So this isn't necessarily telling them that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to take away these things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is laying out a hypothetical question right there. If their hearing In other words, the main tools to let them see and understand it, see the world, how would they relate to the world around them, to the privileges, to all of these things? The first thing that they would really hope to get is basically the tool of hearing, the tool of sight, and certainly the tool of being able to comprehend, which basically is what the heart is supposed to be basically doing and being able to comprehend. In other words, the receptors of comprehension being there. Some scholars actually said that this is an indication that the blessings of hearing is better than the blessing of seeing. Why? Because according to some of the scholars, they said the blessing of hearing is giving you the relationship between you and people. But if you can't hear them, the amount of information that is going to be given to you is going to be very limited. But with sight, you may not have the sight, but your ability to comprehend, understand, communicate information is definitely going to be, at least certainly, you may not be able to see the information, you might not be able to see some of the things, but you would still be capable of communicating human experiences. You would still be capable of sharing a lot of that information because you're able to communicate through hearing, okay, and certainly through talking. ختم على قلوبكم من إله غير الله يأتيكم به. Okay, let's go to Tafsir al-Qurtubi. So Tafsir al-Qurtubi said, well, those are basically a list of the different extremities, or at least a list of different senses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned that use these resources for basically giving you that awareness about the purpose of your existence before من قبل أن نطمس وجوها, before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would, the word natmas, what is the word natmas? This word right here. The word natmas actually means that something is stamped. So what does it mean that the face is stamped? Stamped with what? Like a little stamp? No. So if you were to look at your face and you were to compare your back and your back basically acts as pretty much an empty page. An empty page, you don't see much of it, okay? Just an empty page. No features, really. But the face basically has all the features, all the different features that contain the most important senses and the most important things that help you relate to the world around you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says before that your features are basically gone. In other words, what? They become useless. The resources, the tools that you were given in order to relate to the resources around you are basically the face, the hearing, the seeing. Those are basically the most important resources. Okay, that's basically in the face. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Man ilahun ghayrullah ya'tikum bih." Where if any of these senses were basically stamped, in other words, they were wiped out, who other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would bring you that back again? In other words, make you healthy to use those resources. Of course, certainly, this isn't seeking them to answer the question, because the answer is no. But this is to let them basically relate to the question. So this is important when we're doing a debate. Sometimes we're not necessarily debating them to ask the question as a way to expect an answer. But sometimes we would know the answer, but we want them to relate to the question in order to let them answer the question that I am trying to basically trying to get them to comprehend. So now I'm asking the question, and now I'm taking the same response that I'm trying to let them get to, but this time it's from their mouth. This time it's them putting in this answer. Okay. وَمَعْنَى أَرَأَيْتُمْ, he said, and the meaning of أَرَأَيْتُمْ. So we were talking about أَرَأَيْتُمْ and أَرَأَيْتَكُمْ in order to let people relate to in understanding, in also using these resources, whether it's seeing, whether it's hearing, all of that. So this isn't to necessarily say and talk about seeing as seeing. Okay. But this is actually speaking about knowing something. And there's nothing bigger than knowing like seeing. Because when you see something, you don't doubt what you're seeing. You can doubt, did I hear it? Did I hear something? And probably ask everyone to be silent just to make sure that you had heard something. But when you see something walking in front of you, you would right away know that I had seen something walking. You can bring everyone to tell me that no, I was in delusion, but no, I very well know that I had seen something. So when you look at ara'aytum in the Quran being used, it's not necessarily talking to you about you seeing something and just seeing, but it's telling you because when we're speaking about al-ma'rifah is at different kinds. There's al-ma'rifah, there's knowledge that basically is just plain knowledge that you might know of something. But then there's step number two, which is ayn al-yaqeen and haqq al-yaqeen. There's a difference between haqq al-yaqeen. Haqq al-yaqeen is the second stage of knowing something. You process it, you understand it, it becomes haqq al-yaqeen. It becomes a fact in your mind and you recognize it. But ayn al-yaqeen is when you reach a level of knowledge like you could actually see it. And that's the same thing in Surah Al-Takathur. In Surah Al-Takathur, it basically lets us see those different stages. علم اليقين, حق اليقين, and عين اليقين. So when it says أرأيتم, it basically was referring to عين اليقين. Did you process it? Did you see it? Did you recognize that this hypothetical question, that if your sight was taken away, if your hearing was taken away, if your ability to process the ideas was basically taken away, are you really going to be considering that, no, I'm not going to be making a prayer, or you're going to be making a prayer to the Lord Almighty to bring it back to you? And certainly the answer is we recognize these tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us. And therefore, the first thing that we would think of if it was taken away is to remember the one that had given us that opportunity to see, to hear, and to process ideas. And then we would want to invoke only one Lord Almighty, which is Allah Almighty, in order to give us back these privileges of seeing, hearing, and so forth. Okay. من إله غير الله يأتيكم به. Who's the Lord that's going to, other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's going to give it to you and bring it back to you? Are we talking about ya'tikum bihi? And we went in details. Is it talking about ya'tikum bihi right there? Is this talking about guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give us? Or is this talking about basically the nearest? Indo-Arabiya, whenever you would have a pronoun, the nearest noun is basically what that pronoun refers to. Okay, so the scholars that said that this refers to the nearest noun, which is your hearing, your sight, and your heart, they basically said, well, that's the nearest pronoun. But the other scholars, they said, no, it's the context. The context is telling you, man ya'tikum bihi, referring to guidance. ثم هم يصدفون, and they would basically turn away and become so silent, so bare, so uh, so what is the word? But الصدف, to يصدف عن الشيء, to basically turn away, and it becomes as if they're just blank, and you just don't see any response. The receptors are not there to really recognize what you're letting them, or what you're talking to them about, and recognizing the tools, recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. Okay, so then they become yasdifun, they would turn away and they would become completely idle, completely silent, completely blocked from even understanding the question, understanding the or having the receptors and so forth. وَمَا نُرْسِلُ الْمُرْسَلِينَ إِلَّا مُبَشِّرِينَ وَمُنذِرِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would only send the prophets and the messengers. Okay, how did we get from this one to this one? We got it from this one to this one. Is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying, well, if we're speaking about هل يهلك إلا القوم الظالمون, the ones that would be punished are really the ones that had transgressed the limits. What is transgression? Transgression of a limit meaning? It basically means you having one, the tools to process, the tools to recognize, but not using it. I want you to keep this one. Let's do it again. So if you had the tool of hearing, but you didn't use it for something that is to give you guidance, that means that that's a zalim. Any provision, any resource that you were given, you didn't use it to help you get to Jannah, that's a zalim. Wait, how did you get there? You got there because remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us the story of these people. They basically got the privilege and they even were given the ability to get squeezed in and narrow down their resources in order to help them perhaps trigger the area of seeking ibadah through recognizing al-mas'ala, but then they didn't recognize that. Now, when you look at فتحنا عليهم أبواب كل شيء, that's basically to tell us the resources. If the person does not use the resource for the sake of getting Jannah, then that person is in magnificent and complete loss. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was putting in within that context. If you were to lose your hearing, lose your sight, and lose basically the receptors, the ability to process in your heart, what's the first thing that you're going to want to do? The first thing that you're going to want to do is basically dua al-mas'ala. You're going to get to asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring all these resources back to you because that's the only way for you to relate to success, relate to the world around you. Okay? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ أَرَأَيْتَكُمْ إِنْ أَتَاكُمْ عَذَابُ اللَّهِ بَغْتَةً أَوْ جَهْرَةً هَلْ يُهْلَكُ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الظَّالِمُونَ and وَمَا نُرْسِلُ الْمُرْسَلِينَ إِلَّا مُبَشِّرِينَ وَمُنذِرِينَ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would only send the prophets and the messengers mubashirin. Mubashirin with what? Mubashirin that if they were to use the resources, basically for the sake of finding guidance, that's the best thing. The worst of the people are really the people that have the resources but don't use them for their own advancement. That's a zalim. All the resources that you basically had gotten, what did you do with them? What type of resources? Resources, your time. What did you use your time for? Your life, your hearing, your ability, your intelligence. What did you do with your intelligence? What did you do with your wealth? What did you do with the wealth? What did you do with your health? What did you do with your social status? What was the investment that you had done for your akhirah? So if a person has a privilege but doesn't use that privilege, that's dhulm. That's that oppression. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was saying, وَمَا نُرْسِلُ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. The reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the prophets and the messengers was really mubashirin. It was to bring in that bushra, what is al-Bushra? Al-Bushra is basically that reminder of the glad tidings of Jannah, وَمُنذِرِينَ, and basically to warn them. So what is al-Mubashir? Let's see. Al-Hasan said, مُبَشِّرِينَ بِسِعَةِ الرِّزْقِ فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالثَّوَابِ فِي الْآخِرَةِ. They would be basically giving them that bushra, that congratulations, basically, of giving further rizq, further provisions in this life, and the reward in al-akhirah. What's the evidence? He said, ولو أن أهل القرى آمنوا واتقوا لفتحنا عليهم من بركات من السماء والأرض. The evidence? He said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if the people in that city had believed and lived their religious integrity, the Lord Almighty would have opened the blessings of the heavens and the earth. And we talked about the word barakat compared to فتحنا عليهم أبواب كل شيء. So we're not going to get to that one. فمن آمن وأصلح فلا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. So if we were to look into this one, so the person that basically had the resources, because if you are to look at this portion of ayat, it's really focusing on the resources. Focusing on the resources, whether, let's look into how it focuses on the resources. Number one, here it was talking about reducing the resources. And then here it talks about having these resources available. Okay. And then it wants us to basically think of the resources basically taken away and what would happen again. So it would tell us, well, the resources you were given to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but then we squeezed you in a spot in order for you to remember that these resources are not what you're living for, but you're living for al-ibadah. But then the person didn't recognize it, then they would start making the dua, then the resources open up again. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then tells us, well, okay, we're going to let you hypothetically think of this situation. Your sight, your hearing, in other words, your resources are gone. What's the first thing that you're going to really do? You're going to get into that dua al-mas'ala to bring it back. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells us and lets us know within that context, those that don't use the resources in place are basically the ones that had oppressed themselves. In other words, they're the most ones to be in loss. The most ones to be in loss are the ones to not have the resources. And وَمَا نُرْسِلُ مُرْسَلِينَ إِلَّا مُبَشِّرِينَ وَمُنذِرِينَ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would send basically the prophets and the messengers as reminders and warners, reminders of the glad tidings that they would live in. فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. So if the person uses the resources, then they would be the ones to live in la khawf. Why didn't it just say living in aman? Well, just like it said right there, amana wa aslaha. Who are the people to get these privileges of no fear and no sorrow? So why no fear and not sorrow? Why not say something like no hunger or no thirst? Or maybe live healthy, or maybe you'll get a lot of money. Well, it did say a lot of money or resources, basically in another ayah. But the emphasis on al-iman and the salah and no fear and no sorrow is always there because that's the most thing that all creatures, humans and basically animals as well, that were basically seeking security and seeking happiness. That's لا خوف. How to get that? فَمَنْ آمَنَ وَأَصْلَحَ. Those that would believe and those that would live in piety, live up to the word of the Lord Almighty. In other words, what happened to the other ones? What happened to the other ones is that did they live in aman? Did they believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No. Did they live the principles of the Lord Almighty? No, they didn't. So what did they end up with? Well, they ended up with basically feeling that fear. And how did it look like? أَخَذْنَاهُمْ بَغْتَةً. And then what happened? وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ for the believers. What happened to the other ones? They were basically mublisun. They were basically in complete sorrow, in complete depression. So you gotta, do that that comparison in what word was actually used. So ولا هم يحزنون والذين كذبوا بآياتنا يمسهم العذاب بما كانوا يفسقون. And those that had denied the words of the Lord Almighty. So when you're talking about بآياتنا, الآية is actually a miracle. Okay? Al-ayah is a miracle. So in this situation, are we talking about the context basically telling us about a miracle in the Quran? Or are we talking about bi-ayatina, meaning Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Or is this talking about the different miracles other than the Quran? So what we could see is that different scholars basically had mentioned different, at least areas, but it really means the same thing because Muhammad SAW had come with the Quran. He'd also come with the different miracles, and he had basically come with the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, whether you want it to be in a very specific thing or whether you want it to be more comprehensive in your reference, it's going to be getting to the same idea. يمسهم العذاب بما كانوا يفسقون, that they would be pricked with al-adhab. Wait a minute. So what is al-adhab here then? If you're saying يمسهم العذاب, is this an inclusive al? Is this an al-istighraqiyya or is this an al-ahdiyya? Why is it important to know? Because you're trying to scrutinize and understand and analyze how we understand the structure and the paradigms that we see in the world around us. That's why it's important to know. So when it says يَمَسُّهُمُ الْعَذَابِ, what adhab are we talking about? The adhab of one, the adhab of fear. That's the first punishment that they would get. They would be living in fear. The second adhab would be depression. That's the second adhab. Because, okay, where did I get that from? So I got that from the context within this ayah. Let's say, what is the context of this ayah? The context is basically telling me, وَالَّذِينَ كَذَبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا. In other words, in contrast to فَمَنْ آمَنَ وَأَصْلَحَ, the ones that are living in iman, living in faith, living in basically implementing what faith means, those would be the ones living in no fear and no sorrow. Yet in contrast to those that had lived in faith, basically, they would يَمَسُّهُمُ الْعَذَابِ. In other words, they would not get what these people are getting. So what would they get? Al-adhab. Then al-adhab right there would actually talk about and refer to that they would find fear and they would find sorrow. Even if they had the money, even if they had the money. So how is it that a person would be living in fear? They would be living in fear as a result, basically, of the lifestyle that they're living in. So maybe it's a gain. Okay, if you're a gang member, absolutely you're going to be living in that fear, thinking that people are going to come and attack you. Okay, and believe it or not, I don't know why any girl would join any gang, but I had seen that in prison. Okay, some girls actually joining gangs. At the beginning, basically, it would happen in a way that she basically relates to the boys, a certain boy, and this boy would turn out to be a gang member. Then this gang member, if he doesn't have a principle to live based on, then he's not going to have a principle to deal with you, and he's not going to have any principle at all. Then this girl gets hooked into this gang. Then, of course, then she's abused. Of course, it's going to be most of the times it's going to be sexually and all of that. And then she's going to find herself basically working for them. If she doesn't work for them, they'll basically threaten her if she doesn't do what they tell her. She's basically going to get killed, etc. So then she basically gets hooked into that game. So that's that fear of al-khawf basically coming at her. And وَلَهُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, they would be living in sorrow. So we're not just talking about gains here, but gains are, I guess it's a lot more apparent for us to really see that area. But we're also talking about other people in general. Other people in general, you would basically see that if a person is living not for al-akhirah, but living for dunya, they would be afraid of losing the privileges. They would be afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of losing their money, afraid of losing that. But a mu'min, لا خوف عليهم. Why? Because they know that rizq is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're not afraid of losing rizq. They're not afraid of losing their children or losing all of that because they know that this dunya is daru mamar la daru maqar. They would recognize that this dunya is a place, it's a passage to the hereafter. It's not a place to necessarily live in eternally. So they recognize that this is a bridge. It's not the end of everything. So that's why they don't live in that fear, but they would live in that hope. So if they're not living in fear, they're living in hope. They're also living in aman. They are also living in security. وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. So why are the other ones basically living in sorrow? They would be living in sorrow as a result of the instability that is there in their life. They would also be living in sorrow as a result of basically emptiness, the emptiness that they would find in their heart. That's basically going to be bringing in that adab. That's going to be bringing in that adab بما كانوا يفسقون. So why did they deserve all of that? بما كانوا يفسقون. What is الفسق? فسق actually means to remove the peel off a fruit, making it more susceptible to getting rotten. That's fasaqa. Okay? If you're removing the peel, then you're removing the armor. In other words, if the peel gives it an protection, that means that was the armor right there. So, in other words, for the people, what was supposed to be the armor to give them all this protection is al-iman wa salah. So it was basically faith and piety. That was the armor. But then did they live that protection? Did they live that? No, they didn't. So بما كانوا يفسقون. So they didn't live in that faith and didn't live in that piety. In other words, they became more susceptible to all that adab, to all that torture that they were living in. What was the torture? The torture is not feeling secure and is not feeling mentally stable. Okay? قل لا أقول لكم عندي خزائن الله ولا أعلم الغيب ولا أقول إني ملك. Okay, and I'm not saying that I have khaza'inullah, the treasures of the Lord Almighty. So what does that mean? I don't know, and I'm not the gatekeeper of the provisions and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically give in provisions. Why did this ayah actually say that? Well, that's because it wanted to respond. It didn't say what they had said. Okay. But we would know the inference of what they had said. What did they say? Well, they said if you're the one that basically controls how people would live in happiness and basically in security, then why are we seeing these poor Muslims? Why are we seeing poor Muslims within the society? Why can't they be rich if you really are promising them a life of stability, a life of privilege, a life of that. Well, why aren't they having it right now? So the response is, قُلْ لَا أَقُولُ لَكُمْ عِنْدِي خَزَائِنُ اللَّهِ. I'm not telling you that I have the keys to the treasures of the Lord Almighty, and I don't know the unseen, and I don't tell you that I am in any form or shape, that I'm an angel. I am here just following what was revealed unto me. That is the Prophet ﷺ, basically. I'm just following what was revealed onto me, and I'm basically a prophet just sending you this information. But at the end, in attabi'u illa ma yuha ilay. I'm just going to be following what was revealed onto me, and therefore I basically would just relate to the revelation. Now, here's a sidetrack a little bit. Al-Qurtubi, he said, from what it appears that in the general text, or the general text in within this ayah, that the Prophet ﷺ is only following what would be sent onto him. So then the question is that scholars debated, do the prophets and the messengers actually make their own legislation? In other words, is every legislation that we have, okay, is it directly coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or can the prophets actually make their own, let's call it their own ijtihad, their own evaluation, and their evaluation and their ijtihad basically becoming a legislation for us? Is that something that can happen? So that's a debate between scholars. In short, القرطبي said والصحيح أن الأنبياء يجوز منهم الاجتهاد والقياس على المنصوص والقياس أحد أدلة الشرع. What does that mean? He said, in that what is preponderant is that the prophets, it is something that they could do in terms of ijtihad. What is it, ijtihad? Ijtihad is basically using one, you're evaluating the situation, and then based on that evaluation, you're making a certain ruling. And we're not speaking about interpretation here, but we're speaking about making a general ruling, and that ruling becomes basically ijtihad based on your understanding, based on the Prophet's understanding of the situation. Therefore, there would be that qiyas, the analogy, okay, the analogy that they would learn from what the wahi had taught them, and they would then explain using the analogy of al-wahi, basically the legal maxims, okay, and then that would become something that we would consider it as a resource in Islam. And why is that the preponderant? That the Prophet himself, yeah, he might have done his own evaluation, he might have done his own ruling, but then we would say that it's still a legislation. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you look at the different ayat, okay, the different ayat, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يا أيها النبي لما تحرم ما أحل الله لك تبتغي مرضات أزواجك. So the Prophet ﷺ, at one point, he did do his ijtihad, but whenever the ijtihad or the evaluation would go wrong, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would directly correct the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, the Prophet ﷺ would be corrected on the spot to tell him, no, that's not something that you had basically done right. Same thing if we're talking about the Battle of Uhud, when he had basically suggested that he would follow the opinion of the opinion of those that wanted to maintain the hostages. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that it was not befit for the Prophet to basically have these hostages. In other words, you needed to do something else. That was not the right plan. Okay, same thing, certainly. If you were to look at other instances, at the end is that in situations where it is not related to the deen, and it's a prophet's personal preference. The Prophet ﷺ had not eaten a dab. It's basically that kind of lizard that lives in the desert. And the Prophet ﷺ just said, I didn't get used to this eating basically these things. And but he told them to eat from it. He told them to eat from it. So what did he do? Basically just put his own preference. And I guess the clearer one is basically when the Prophet ﷺ had told them not to hit on the palm tree bark, and then the trees didn't pollinate the following year. And then they had explained that you told us not to hit on the bark, the tree barks, and we didn't. And here we go. The trees didn't pollinate. And then the Prophet ﷺ tells them, أنتم أعلم بأمور دنياكم. You know better about the matters of your dunya. So what does that mean? There are certain things that are basically ijtihad from the Prophet ﷺ. It's basically an evaluation from the Prophet ﷺ that in that situation, we would basically consider if it's related to the deen, yes, it becomes a legislation. It becomes a legislation, even if it's probably qiyas. But if it is irrelevant to the deen, and we basically prove that it's irrelevant to the deen, but more of a personal choice from the Prophet ﷺ, then in that situation, it would not be a legislation. It would be something that the Prophet ﷺ had not preferred for himself, at least. Okay? Or probably preferred for himself. So then we would look at it from that angle, exactly like al-dab. He told them to eat from it, but for himself, he wasn't into eating it because it wasn't part of his culture. Okay. قُلْ هَلْ يَسْتَوِي الْأَعْمَى وَالْبَصِيرُ? And tell them, is a person that is blind equal to a person that is capable of seeing? أَفَلَا تَتَفَكَّرُونَ? Do you not ponder? And of course, the answer is, well, did they give the answer? هل يستوي الأعمى والبصير? The answer is no, they didn't give the answer. But that's because the answer is known to everybody. There's no need to say, well, yeah, this is what you'd say. And yeah, since you said yes, the blind is not equal to a person that can see. Now here's what we're going to say. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically put in the question, not as a question, but that's basically an informative clause, and not here giving me a question that he is basically asking you to answer. That's why it said, أَفَلَا تَتَفَكَّرُونَ. Ended that ayah by saying, أَفَلَا تَتَفَكَّرُونَ? Do you not think deeply and scrutinize the words that you had basically said? أَفَلَا تَتَفَكَّرُونَ? Did you not think of how, since a blind person is not equal to a seeing person, that the same thing, that al-a'ma, is it referring to a blind person, meaning metaphorically blind? Blind meaning not seeing the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not seeing guidance. And al-basir would basically be a person that sees the guidance, that is the believer. Okay? Or is it the person that has the knowledge and the person that doesn't have the knowledge? Is this basically referring to them metaphorically? أَفَلَا تَتَفَكَّرُونَ? Do they not say how they're different? Do they not say how similar, different, etc.? وأنذر به الذين يخافون أن يحشروا إلى ربهم ليس لهم من دونه ولي ولا شفيع لعلهم يتقون. So this is what we're going to continue tomorrow, inshallah. This ayah, أنذر به الذين يخافون أن يحشروا إلى ربهم. Before we end, any questions? I guess no one has any questions. Everybody's excited to go sleep. Okay.